Hello, I am Andrea Capovilla, the director of the Ingeborg Bachmann Center, and I'm very pleased to welcome you and introduce this year's speaker, Deborah Holmes, who will be giving the Ingeborg Bachmann Center Biennial lecture. Deborah Holmes is an assistant professor at the University of Salzburg. She has published widely on Austrian literature from the 19th century to the present, and she is the co-editor of the journal Austrian Studies. Her talk today is based on a major piece of work she has just completed and submitted as her habilitation, and which will be published by Legenda in due course. Deborah will talk about the much debated concept and catchphrase of genius, and specifically how it was discussed in relation to gender at the Fin-de-siècle. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very much for inviting me today. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to say thank you very much also for hosting me last year between January and June, so last academic year. Between January and June, I was Sylvia Nash visiting fellow at the Ingeborg Bachmann Center and was wonderfully looked after both by Andrea Capovilla and by Jane Lewin, to whom a special thanks on this occasion. Without further ado, I shall get on to my lecture, Genius and Gender in Fin-de-siècle Vienna. Now, genius is a very attention-grabbing term to put in a lecture title or any kind of title. It evokes a long, rich tradition which stretches back to classical antiquity, and yet it still continues to pack an immediate contemporary punch. Genius is frequently used today in many different contexts and many different registers, sometimes as a matter for debate, but more often simply as an unquestioned superlative accolade. And I've been keeping an eye on the newspapers lately. As far as genius is concerned, The Guardian, for instance, over the last couple of months has described Paul McCartney as a genius, Vaughan Williams as a genius, and very recently, on the sad occasion of her passing, Hilary Mantel as a genius. So it has this, it continues to be a very current term. Now, this remarkable evocative power coexists with, or perhaps indeed stems from, genius's opacity. What does it actually denote? How do we suppose it to work or to manifest itself? And how are we to assess its validity as a personal characteristic, as an evaluative term, or potentially as even an entirely separate category of being? What is genius? Explaining anyone's achievements by attributing them to genius is, as the classicist Penelope Murray once wrote, and I quote, tantamount to saying that we do not know how they were accomplished. So one of the many phenomena implied by genius would therefore seem to be a certain helplessness or a priori limitation on the part of anyone trying to pin it down, which is, I think, a salutary starting point, helplessness that is, for any academic undertaking. Scholars of genius can, however, take comfort from the knowledge that they are in good company. During the Enlightenment, whilst genius was being established as a modern term, one of its most important commentators was Diderot, who constantly underlined his inability to define it. He refers elegantly to the je ne sais quoi of genius. Some generations later, the Jena Romantics, who were, of course, hugely influential in developing Genie in German, held fast to the idea that it was ineffable, even as they theoretically opened it up to everybody. To them, genius was the defining feature of what they imagined as having been humankind's original utopian state. So it's accessible to everybody, or should be accessible to everybody, but it's ineffable. We can't define or explain it. In my work, I follow the example of Anne Jefferson, who writes in her inspiring study, Genius in France, that came out in 2014, and I quote, questions addressed to genius, even in the likely absence of any reply, are preferable to statements about genius. So today, I won't be attempting to explain genius's role as such in the Viennese Fin-de-siècle, nor will I be trying to determine which of Vienna's artists, musicians, or authors at this point we can or should refer to as geniuses. Instead, I will be interrogating the work of genius, that is, the work that genius did as a discourse, or a set of discourses in the writing of a selection of Viennese figures from this period. Genius may be impossible to define, but we can certainly trace continuities in the expectations, the language, and the imagery that are associated with it, even as these associations vary in meaning and force over the centuries, depending on the milieu which take genius up. It is this combination of constancy and variation which makes genius, I would argue, a revealing index to the preoccupations of an era. Now I'll begin by looking at some of these discursive continuities, so genius's discursive continuities, among which I will be suggesting is a particular sensitivity or volatility as regards gender. Then I'll consider briefly why genius is especially relevant at the Fin-de-siècle before going on to my author case studies. So 3 parts to the lecture, basically, whereby the last part is the longest. Now, theories and meditations on genius are to be found in the writing of many protagonists of Fin-de-siècle Vienna, from the world famous to the now largely forgotten. And I'll be focusing today on 3 women writers, Elsa Asenijeff, Rosa Mayreder, and Grete Meisel-Hess. So on to the first part of my lecture, discursive continuities. One characteristic that we can safely claim for genius is that paradoxes feature prominently in its discursive history from the very beginning. From the late 17th century onwards, modern vernacular terms, genie, genius, genio, and so on, developed across Europe, stemming from the double Latin root genius and ingenium, or basically stemming from this double root. There are other influences as well. These are the 2 main ones. So a genius was a life force or a tutelary spirit, a guardian, like a guardian angel, external and supernatural in origin, but nevertheless inextricably linked to a, brackets male, brackets closed, human individual, and their defining characteristics. So an external supernatural force. Ingenium could likewise refer to a person's character, or else to specific traits or aptitudes which could be understood as divine gifts, but which were inborn, so internal, anchored and acting internally. So there we have the first paradox, so external, internal. Where does genius come from? Does it come from outside? Does it come from inside? Modern genius maintained the potential to reactivate aspects and the iconography of these older meanings while becoming associated above all with originality and innovation, with scientific breakthroughs, for instance, or with the emergence of new art forms or styles. In the 18th and the early 19th century in particular, genius was invariably used in debates on the origins and essence of human creativity. Was it, human creativity, naturally occurring, or was it supernaturally inspired? Genius obviously hangs together with secularization at this point as well. Was creativity, human creativity, conscious and deliberate, or dreamlike and frenzied? Was it powered more by the intellect or more by the imagination? Could it be improved by training or practice or teaching, or was it best left entirely to its own devices? So genius, therefore, as we can see from this short set of questions, played an important role in the development of aesthetics as a philosophical discipline, as well as in ideas about the sovereign individual in a post-feudal age. And it's surely significant that from the late 18th century onwards, being a genius replaced having genius as the more common usage. So a genius became the person rather than the quality or attribute. The emergence of modern genius coincided not only with the emergence of the modern so-called universal subject, but also with a series of upheavals in normative gender roles. That genius or geniuses are invariably male is a truism of research on genius that has tended to distract from the many nuances of what genius has to offer the history of gender, and vice versa. It is, of course, undeniable that genius has most often been associated with men over the centuries, and that it has often been used to reinforce a masculinist patriarchal view of creativity from which women are excluded, seemingly by definition. Nevertheless, women and all notions of femininity have also always participated or been implicated in genius. And there have always been thinkers and writers of all sexes who have entertained female genius as a possibility, even at points in European history where we might suppose otherwise. You've just got to go looking for them. The discursive effectiveness of genius would seem to me to be due not so much to its unrelieved maleness or masculinity, but rather to its potential for gender volatility. As with other discursive characteristics of genius, the extent and nature of this gender volatility varies according to era and milieu. During Empfindsamkeit, for example, a natural, untutored or untutored sounding style was considered a mark of genius in literature. The emphasis on emotional authenticity over formalized education offered increased potential for the validation of feminine characteristics in literature and for women to be involved in genius discourse. And the poet Anna Louise Karsch is quite often given as an example of this, the possibility of female or feminine genius. Less accessible to women was the iconoclastic Kraftgenie model of the Sturm und Drang, or else later classicist notions of cultivated genius, so their classical education was necessary, or a couple of journeys to Italy, or whatever, things that weren't as accessible to women to start off with. So cultivated classicist genius, nevertheless, continued to highlight certain characteristics as being both specifically feminine, in inverted commas, of course, and necessary for exceptional creativity, intuition and imagination, for instance. But classicist genius required these to be contained in and powered by a male body. So exceptional creativity comes from the encapsulation, as it were, of feminine attributes, so intuition and imagination, in a strong, potent male body. That's the definition of genius. In the writing, for example, a later writing of Goethe and at points in Wilhelm von Humboldt. In German language romanticism, so slightly later, as I've already briefly indicated, genius reached new heights and new depths, also as regards its gender ambivalence. The Schlegels and Novalis, for example, partly in reaction to Kant, but I'm not going to go into that today. The Schlegels and Novalis imagined genius as a synthetic force that subsumes not only everything required by art, but also everything required for a fulfilled existence. So theoretically, at least, it can dissolve binaries, including gender binaries. Genius to the Romantics is regained wholeness, a creative state of authenticity and possibility, which they believe to have been lost to the swiftly modernizing society of their times. And these are aspects of genius discourse that resurface with a vengeance at the Fin-de-siècle, as we will see. Now, Schopenhauer takes up this idea of genius as being out of step with modern mass society and turns it into an actively hostile relationship. Schopenhauer was, of course, an immensely influential figure throughout the 19th century and beyond in genius discourse. And his concept of genius is an always isolated, always male, always artist figure. The Schopenhauerian genius is characterized above all by his capacity for absolute objectivity, for reine Kontemplation. But he is only able to achieve this potential intermittently, and this is the interesting point. Between times, he's subject to melancholy, doubt, and physical and mental weaknesses. The precarious state of genius in Schopenhauer is bound up with the ambiguities of its gender status. So while Schopenhauer is adamant, as I'm sure we all know, while Schopenhauer is adamant that women cannot be geniuses, femininity, or rather qualities and experiences encoded as feminine, are fundamental to his conception of genius in uneasy combination with a male physis. And here I have a little sound bite from Schopenhauer for you. Die Grundbedingung, so the precondition of genius, ist ein abnormes Überwiegen der Sensibilität über die Irritabilität und Reproduktionskraft. Und zwar, was die Sache erschwert, auf einem männlichen Körper. Denn Weiber können bedeutendes Talent, aber kein Genie haben, denn sie bleiben stets subjektiv. So on the slides, I have the German original and then an English translation, which is my own translation. They're just working translations. I won't be reading out the English, just the German. So the male genius in Schopenhauer is further characterized by receptivity and Willenlosigkeit, so more qualities that one might traditionally associate more with women than with men. His creative processes, that is of the Schopenhauerian genius, result from einer instinktartigen Notwendigkeit, so they're instinctive, they're necessary through instinct. And his works of art are referred to as unsterbliche Kinder, so immortal children, produced through an innere Qual, so inner torment, that Schopenhauer equates with the involuntary nature of childbirth. Schopenhauer therefore simultaneously idealizes and problematizes genius, both psychologically and physiologically, bequeathing to the later 19th century an unstable, gender ambivalent figure that is nevertheless set within a highly prescriptive set of gender norms and set against the reductive anti-democratic foil of the masses. And a lot of this is taken on by Nietzsche, of course, whom I won't be talking about in any detail today, but we have to have him in mind. Nietzsche was leery of the actual term génie or genius, particularly in his middle and later works, was very critical of what had become of the idea of genius in the later 19th century. And his Übermensch can be seen as an attempt to devise a new and alternative genius figure that's freed of the sort of bourgeois accretions that the term has gradually taken on, but also basically elitist, anti-democratic, the artist or the individual male genius pitted against mass modern society. As the 19th century progressed, ever more, brackets male, philosophers and increasingly natural scientists felt moved to declare that women could not possibly ever be geniuses. Immense energy was repeatedly invested in arguing something that was supposedly self-evident, which to me reveals genius's gender volatility once again. The misogynistic, anti-Semitic sensation of the Viennese Fin-de-siècle that was Otto Weininger made women's lack of genius a fundamental premise of his monumental Geschlecht und Charakter, eine prinzipielle Untersuchung, which came out in 1903. Weininger exploits to the utmost a further discursive constant of genius, the power that it has accrued as a term, not only to launch or to fuel polemics, as in the Sturm und Drang, but also to close discussion down or to evade discussion. Genius as a last word, as a self-contained circular Totschlag-argument. So, genius is what can put a stop to an argument just through its sheer existence. In Weininger's book, genius is presented as the ultimate goal and ideal of humanity. It is also synonymous with maleness, with man. As he sets up a dichotomy between male and female, which is absolute in the final instance, genius therefore serves to prove women's inherent inferiority. Genius is everything that she is not and cannot be, and vice versa. So it's a completely sort of tautological circular argument. And I just have two short quotes here. Weininger writes, will man überhaupt vom Wesen der Genialität eine Vorstellung sich bilden und zu einem Begriffe derselben zu gelangen suchen, so muss die Frau als ungenial bezeichnet werden. Or a little later on, ein weiblicher Genius ist eine Contradictio in adjecto, denn Genialität war ja nur gesteigerte, voll entfaltete, höhere, allgemein bewusste Männlichkeit. So, with Weininger, I've arrived at the second section of my lecture, the Fin-de-siècle. His Geschlecht und Charakter is just one particularly egregious example of the intensified debate on gender and genius at this time. Urte Helduser, in her 2005 study Geschlechterprogramme, writes of the, quote, Vergeschlechtlichung des Genies 1900, so the sexualization of genius around 1900, as a symptom, a particular symptom of the general crisis or sense of crisis that pervaded German language culture at this time. Writers across the literary spectrum in the Fin-de-siècle were preoccupied with the perceived hollowness of bourgeois or bürgerliche values. Many seized on genius as a possible solution, or at least as a response to degeneration and decline. Now, as I've mentioned, genius maintained the potential to reactivate its earlier associations with the supernatural and the mythological. At the Fin-de-siècle, it was used to blur the boundaries between rational and irrational models for explaining human creativity and human progress. Also as a rich source of hyperbolic emphasis, dramatic tension, and irony. So because genius is opaque and has an affinity with extremes, it poses inherent challenges to the central features of realism, such as psychological plausibility or plot causality. As post- and anti-realist developments gain traction at the Fin-de-siècle, genius comes into its own. With reference to its romantic variant, for example, it can be intriguingly anachronistic. So genius is both behind and ahead of its time. So it's left over, the romantics claimed, left over from this utopian originary state of humankind, but it's also a possible future solution for the state of mankind. So it's both behind and in front of us, but it's also above and beyond time as an ideal. Authors at the Fin-de-siècle were hyper-aware of themselves as representatives of a particular time, of a decadent epoch that had outlived itself and was weighed down by the past. So genius in its anachronicity offers a possible escape route from this time trap. Already in the decades preceding 1900, the German naturalist movement had appropriated genius in programmatically masculine terms as a chiffre for a revitalized, potent way of writing. An ideal of masculinist, if not to say macho genius, also underlay the irrational, violent rhetoric employed by some authors of the up-and-coming expressionist generation. And then Schopenhauerian genius continues to be influential with its physiological difficulties, and it prepares the ground well for new biologizing theories such as Cesare Lombroso's equation of genius with both maleness and madness. Lombroso's Genio e Follia, so genius and insanity, was first made available in German, also Genie und Wahnsinn, in 1887, so it's a Fin-de-siècle phenomenon. At the same time, we have to be aware that there's a counter-narrative of a sovereign, serene genius that can be seen in the monumentalizing tendencies of the late 19th century, so also around the Fin-de-siècle. Historical figures of individual male geniuses are repeatedly referenced in the public sphere, so in political speeches, but also in the form of statutory monuments, memorials in public spaces. Now, this is genius as schematic vehicles for national tradition and nationalist sentiments, particularly after the forming of the German Empire. This is genius standing, therefore, not for creative madness, but rather for self-evident authority and for order. And the figure that's repeatedly used here is Goethe. Now, hyper-awareness of the Fin-de-siècle as a moment of crisis was particularly pronounced among female intellectuals, whose steadily growing access to education and the literary market stood in ever crasser contradiction to their legal and social status, to their inferior legal and social status. Given the influential nature and the vehemence of the Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Weininger tradition that persisted in excluding women from genius per se, it's no surprise that they were also drawn to genius, not least within the ambit of the burgeoning women's movement. Women's engagement with genius was by no means merely defensive, however. They were attracted to genius also as an emancipatory discourse of enhanced selfhood and of the transgression of norms. As contradictory as it may seem, many Fin-de-siècle feminists were enthusiastic, if not uncritical, Nietzscheanerinnen, and among these we can count all three of my examples today. And that brings me to section 3 of my lecture, my case studies, my three authors. I will present these chronologically according to the publication dates of the texts that I'm going to discuss, rather than the dates of the authors themselves. So my first example, Elsa Asenijeff, who you already saw on this slide. That's also a photo of her around 1900 in a rather elaborate gown. My first example is a particularly intriguing figure, or at least I find her particularly intriguing. Elsa Asenijeff was born to a wealthy middle-class family in Vienna in 1867. Following her father's death in 1890, she was precipitated into marriage with a Bulgarian diplomat, an unhappy union that ended in divorce in 1896. And she embarks on her literary career in that same year. Her first collection of short stories, Ist das die Liebe, so Is That Love, came out in 1896 and was reviewed in glowing terms by Michael Georg Conrad in the naturalist journal Die Gesellschaft. This prepared the ground for the success of her next book-length publication, which was a manifesto-like volume of essays and aphorisms entitled Aufruhr der Weiber und das dritte Geschlecht, so Unrest or Upset Among Women and the Third Sex, which came out in 1898. It was also around this time, around 1898, that she met the artist and sculptor Max Klinger, whose partner and muse and hostess and publicist she was to remain until 1916. So I've given you here two images, two portraits of Asenijeff that Klinger created, one the Ex Libris, Beauty Victorious, and a bust of the writer that dates from around this period and is now in the Neue Pinakothek in Munich. Anyone judging from the subject matter of Elsa Asenijeff's first story collection, Ist das die Liebe, could be forgiven for expecting to find her at the forefront of the organized women's movement of her times. These brief but memorable stories relate the fates of young women who have been kept ignorant in the name of virtue, their heads filled with romantic illusions, and who end up in loveless, often abusive marriages, unable to make sense of their own instincts or desires and exploited by their families in various ways. The details and the narrative perspectives vary, but a sense of hopelessness and entrapment suffuses the whole collection. In her later publications, Asenijeff remains steadfast in her rejection of hypocritical bourgeois morality. But in her very next book, so this Aufruhr der Weiber und das dritte Geschlecht, she nevertheless takes up a very clear stand against women's emancipation in the legal or educational sense. Equality, she proclaims, is a pernicious idea that can only end in ruin. Now, I'd like to take a closer look at this text to show how she uses not only genius as a superlative instance, but also many individual aspects or images from genius discourse to argue her view of what women are and what they need. Now, she opens by introducing the third sex of her title. These are the pitiful, misguided women who campaign for emancipation. I have some quotations here. Wie? Höre ich recht? Die Frauen wollen hinabsteigen und gleich werden? Sollten sie wirklich schon so arm sein? So rather than viewing equality as a prerequisite for women's self-determination, Asenijeff ironically portrays emancipated women as die wahren Mannsgeschaffene, so the true products of man, Männeräffchen. So emancipated women are men's monkeys, so imitators of men. Instead of questioning the bases of the male world, which to Asenijeff is work outside the home, financial responsibility, public service, the legal system, the universities, and so on. Instead of questioning the bases of this world, so-called emancipated women commit the mistake of loading its shackles and its pressures onto themselves. They will, however, never be able to make this male world their own because it's hostile to women's very essence. So they will end up sucked dry by vampiric man and limited to slavishly copying and obeying him. What promises liberation is, in fact, Asenijeff howls, she's really very insistent on this point, she's very exasperated. What promises liberation is, in fact, a Verdummungstretmühle, so a kind of a stupefying treadmill, a treadmill that will end up in making women stupid. Asenijeff memorably adapts the last lines of the second part of Goethe's Faust to drive her point home. This is my second quotation on this slide. Das ewig Männliche zieht uns hinab. So nicht das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan, but das ewig Männliche zieht uns hinab. Hieße es nicht besser so und lässt sich das Wort nicht als Tafel auf den Eingang aller Emanzipationsbestrebungen des Weibes setzen? So Asenijeff rejects equality for women on the basis of a paradoxical definition of what femininity is. She believes both that there is such a thing as a true feminine essence, a true woman, das echte Weib, but also that this essence consists in absolute individualism. So true women are all the same, but all different. Men, by contrast, are a mass of drones, whereas even the most insignificant woman is a free spirit, a deeply mysterious creatrix. She describes women as die immer anderen, so always other. They're a heroic, suffering elite. Here I have another couple of quotes. Stolze, einsame Seelen, die immer erkannt und nie gewünscht und nichts erhofft. Sie kennen einander, das ist alles. Women are so individual and individualistic that they refuse collaborative action or organized sociability of any kind. And hence the women's movement is an unnatural contradiction in terms. Women can't and shouldn't work together. At the same time, their sheer presence is nevertheless vital to humanity as a collective whole. Women are gleich Edelgestein in die Massen gemeinen Minerals versprengt. So they're like precious jewels that are scattered in the mass of common material that is the rest of humanity. All women are like precious jewels. All true women. Asenijeff goes as far as to say that culture has always been exclusively the work of women, whereas men produce nothing but utilitarian civilization. Men are partial, rational, economical, partial in the sense of not whole, not in the sense of prejudging, partial, rational, economical, logical, pedestrian. Whereas women represent sheer abundance, excess even, emotional richness and depth of insight. So another couple of little quotes. Das Weib ist der edle Verschwender, der große, sich überreich fühlende Vergeuder. Or im Manne wächst ein Gedanke aus dem anderen als ein ewiger Teilungsprozess heraus. Das Weib denkt im Rüsselsprung. As these quotations show, Asenijeff claims not just for single exceptional women, but for women in general, for true women in general, the defining characteristics of Schopenhauerian genius: isolation, suffering, unique insight, immense sensitivity, unpredictability, and the potential to make an invaluable contribution to posterity. At times, the similarities speak for themselves. At others, they are made explicit through analogy. So, for instance, alles Seiende ist Schmerzgeborenes. Darum können sich die zwei großen Gebäre, Genie und Weib, so gut verstehen. Weib und Genie sind heroisch. Once again, das Weib ist wenig intelligent. Es ist wie das Genie tief. Or else, wir empfinden intuitiv, wir ist women there, wir empfinden intuitiv wie das Genie. Dasselbe hat nur selten Begründungen für sein Verkünden geben können. In some respects, however, true women are superior to Schopenhauer's intermittently creative genius figures, or rather, they take the model of individual genius to a more radical conclusion. Woman, true woman, has no need or desire to discuss or publicize her thoughts or deeds. She achieves her genius effect without any outward effort. So wirkend und segenspendend, wie man sich Götter dachte, nämlich unsichtbar. She's not limited to the sporadic production of artworks like Schopenhauer's genius. Femininity à la Asenijeff is a bottomless, endlessly renewable resource whose depths and authenticity provide the only genuine antidote to the man-made evils of monotonous modernity. Asenijeff acknowledges that the male world of laws, science, politics, and so on stems from the ideas and inventions that were once the expression of individual male genius. As institutions and systems, however, they've become empty ends in themselves, and they stand in the way of tiefes Schauen, that is the mark of true genius and true femininity. Male genius in Asenijeff is therefore condemned to stymie itself. Asenijeff uses classical genius iconography to encapsulate this. Even the most genius of men's inventions are crutches, she writes, whereas women have wings. Their genius is not what they do or produce, but the way that they are. So Asenijeff associates woman and genius very closely, but she never collapses the two categories. While she repeatedly elevates das echte Weib using the symbolic capital and other aspects of genius discourse, she never says that women are or can be or should be geniuses. Even this most prestigious of man-made institutions or categories could be a lure to the treadmill. Even women artists must beware. So I think this next quotation is very revealing. Wenn das Weib aus Talent, aus Drang schafft, so is artistically creative, I read this as being, so ist ihm dies doch nie Lebensaufgabe, nie Befriedigung wie dem Manne. Selbst wenn es eine geniale Leistung zustande brächte, genial nach Männerwertschätzung, so wäre es für dasselbe doch nur ein Spielzeug, entsprechend seines Könnens gewaltig. And the italics are Asenijeff's there. And then again, these are maxims from the second half of the book. They stand alone. Ein Vergnügen, aber keine Arbeit. Ein Schaffen wie Götterwelten schaffen, gäbe es Götter. Ohne Wollen, aus der Übermacht hervorgequollen, nicht aus dem Fleiße. At the same time, what makes individual men geniuses in Asenijeff's eyes is their relative femininity, their feminine component. This I also have as a quotation, yes. So mag es durch Umstände oder wegen Anlagemangel oder aus schamhafter Verheimlichung scheinbar keine weiblichen Genies gegeben haben, eins ist sicher. Gibt es keine weiblichen Genies, so ist doch jedes Genie ein halbes Weib. Die Weisheit des Weibes in des Mannes Leib, das ist Genie. So one of the reasons why I think she doesn't go right out there and claim that women are and can be geniuses is that das echte Weib must be an unadulterated, pure expression of her sex. She cannot or should not therefore aspire to genius, as we see here, is a mixed gender category in Asenijeff's definition. Genius is the highest that man has to offer, but it's not a pure expression of his sex. Pure masculinity in Asenijeff's scheme is represented by the machine-like drone, rule-bound and visionless. Her definition of genius is therefore the diametrical opposite of Weininger's, at least in this respect. Now, I don't have much more time to talk about Asenijeff today, but I would like to just quickly note how her fictional prose develops alongside these discursive texts. The stories in Ist das die Liebe, so her first collection in 1896, are relatively short, but they can certainly still be referred to as stories that with characterization, narrative development, and so on. By contrast, the texts of her second collection, Sehnsucht, which came out in 1898, so at the same time as Aufruhr der Weiber, reflect in their very brevity and their apodictic, hermetic style both the uncompromising nature of her gender theorizing and the mystic tone that she brings to her definitions of das echte Weib. The relationship between Weib and world, between Weib and genius, that she seeks to portray resists narrative treatment. So the narrative openings of these later texts break down into impressionistic sketches or disembodied dialogues between nameless instances that are identified only by pronouns and not gendered pronouns, interestingly, du, ihr, wir. This is not meant as a criticism. I just think it's very interesting that the more her gender theories become fixed, the harder it is for her to tell stories about them. So, but anyway, on to my next author. Rosa Mayreder, is perhaps the best known of the three that I'm talking about today. She was the daughter of a wealthy Viennese publican. She wasn't allowed to follow her intellectual leanings as a girl, but she was permitted to train as an artist. You can see one of her watercolors there, picture of a pond in the Wienerwald off dem Kurbenzel. And she studied with Tina Blau, whose works and career she also supported with very incisive reviews, which she published, however, under a male pseudonym, Franz Arnold. Mayreder was a self-taught philosopher, and she became one of the driving forces behind the women's movement in Vienna in the decade prior to 1900. I say behind the women's movement, but actually she was at the forefront of the women's movement in the decade up to 1900. Asenijeff would have no doubt considered her as a misguided member of the drittes Geschlecht. Mayreder was co-initiator and vice president of the Allgemeine Österreichische Frauenverein, so the first serious middle class, but very serious women's organization in Austria, which was founded in 1893. And together with its president, Augusta Fickert, and Marie Lang, she edited a pioneering bi-monthly periodical entitled Dokumente der Frauen, which came out between 1899 and 1902. Highly to be recommended, can be read online nowadays. It published fiction, but also discursive pieces on women's rights and reports on women's organizations and achievements from around the world. From 1902 onwards, Mayreder, however, withdrew from the organized women's movement, though she continued to write in its support. Her best-known work is the collection of essays Kritik der Weiblichkeit, which came out in 1905, which is her essays from the period up to 1905. She carries on working on it, though, and later versions come out over the next couple of decades, in fact, but I'll be talking about the 1905 versions today. Mayreder's main objectives as an activist were equal access to education and an end to prostitution, which she saw as a primitive institution that was holding back the higher development of humanity. And this is in notable opposition to prominent members of Vienna's male avant-garde, some prominent members of Vienna's male avant-garde. Like Asenijeff, she was concerned that modern mass society was having a deadening effect on women in particular. In the foreword to Kritik der Weiblichkeit, she describes the Fin-de-siècle as a time of Niedergang, so of decline, due to its Verarmung an Idealen, an hochgestimmten Gefühlen, an gläubigem Enthusiasmus. Unlike Asenijeff, her response to this was to question the value of gender in understanding the development and the current needs of the human race. Mayreder sees nothing sacred or revealing in the categories man and woman, or very little that's revealing anyway. She criticizes them for their basis in averages and approximations. These categories are primarily used, she writes, to justify a leveling approach that has accrued far too much normative power. She admits that there are certain characteristics of the sexes on a very basic level of instinct and biology that are different, but she presents these differences as something that we should be trying to develop away from, to overcome or to sublimate. They have very little to say about us in the modern age. Well, that's what she would like it to be. That's how she would like it to be. Gender categories she presents as particularly damaging because they impinge most on exceptional individuals and the possibilities which these exceptional individuals are given to fulfill their potential. Mayreder makes it clear from the very beginning of Kritik der Weiblichkeit that these exceptions are her primary concern. She's most interested in those who are born freie Geister, freie Persönlichkeiten, with a particular talent for individual development. Why, she asks, should society make laws or observe conventions that are aimed at the average or at a generalized view of humanity, when it is always, to her way of thinking, an elite, a minority who contributes the most to cultural and intellectual progress? Any attempts to reform the law, the education system, and so on, should be made with reference to the needs of exceptional individuals. And exceptional women, Mayreder writes, exceptional women require a special consideration, as the norms of femininity are so much more restrictive than those of masculinity. Masculinity has become like a panzer, like a suit of armor. It may weigh heavy on the weak, but it allows the strong plenty of room to grow and to fit into it and to use it. Whereas femininity is like a corset, which for the freie Persönlichkeit is limiting from the very start and must be burst if it is to develop at all. So rather than taking the average woman as a reason to treat all women the same, exceptional women should be taken as a reason to treat all women differently. That's the basis of her feminism, proto-feminism. Considering her emphasis on the exceptional individual, Mayreder uses the term genius, so Genie or Genialität, relatively sparingly. When she does use it, however, it marks neuralgic points in her essays, points where she gets stuck and resorts to genius to break an impasse, or else points where she's in danger of contradicting herself, in particular as regards her self-professed disregard for the normative power of gender. An instance of the former, so her using genius as a last resort to break out of an argument she's got stuck in or that she can't resolve otherwise, is her attempt to argue exactly how exceptional individuals benefit society, how their unconventional ideas can be put into practice for everybody. Mayreder is no callous elitist. She realizes that privileging exceptional individuals puts her on difficult, if not potentially dangerous ground. Her admiration for Nietzsche, for example, is tempered by a keen awareness that in the wrong hands, his philosophy could be used to justify ruthlessness and oppression. She criticizes his idea of the Übermensch for the overriding Gefühl der Unverantwortlichkeit, so the sense of irresponsibility that she sees as its main characteristic. She remains an elitist, nevertheless, and is therefore in a dilemma. On the one hand, she describes the women's movement as the enthusiastic dream of a few, a very few. On the other, she realizes that this dream must be able to inform new norms for the many if it's to have any lasting effects. So that's the second quote on this slide that I have up at the moment. She, when trying to sort of argue or discuss or think about how this few and their ideas might then have a positive effect on the many, she has to skirt round how this might actually work. She's not sure of how to argue it or how it will actually function. I think this is one of the reasons why she herself withdrew from the organized women's movement at this point, because she couldn't see her role in it going forward with her elitist ideals. To solve this impasse, this argumentative Sackgasse, she uses an analogy with artistic genius. Soweit die progressive Geistigkeit sittlich schöpferisch ist, soweit ist sie, ähnlich wie die künstlerische Genialität, auf ein Publikum verwiesen. Der Gedanke, eine neue Lebensform zu schaffen, ein neues Gesetz zu verkünden, hat immer zur heroischen Stimmung der ganz Großen unter den Menschen der progressive Geistigkeit gehört. So she valorizes social reform by association with artistic genius, while casting the majority as the receptive audience of the exceptional individuals whose destiny it is to lead the way, but she doesn't actually tell us how this top-down approach is going to work in practice. Genius also appears in Kritik der Weiblichkeit in two conspicuous instances where Mayreder, having disdained gender categories as limiting and demeaning, nevertheless attempts to salvage aspects of them as achievements or benefits. Although she rejects femininity as any kind of definable essence, she does not wish to see all of its trappings thrown overboard. The attributes of conventional femininity that are compatible with free thought should, she writes, be upheld as potentially valuable products of cultural evolution. In the essay Das Weib als Dame, so the woman as the lady, for example, she argues for a revitalization of the social finesse associated with the historical role of the great lady and uses genius to legitimize this. She writes, Man könnte wohl die Stellung des Weibes als Dame aus einer Entfaltung und Geltendmachung spezifisch weiblicher Genialität zu erklären versuchen. Zwar gilt es heutzutage für ausgemacht, dass das Genie nur beim männlichen Geschlecht auftritt. Dabei übersieht man aber, dass die weibliche Genialität sich gewöhnlich auf andere Gebiete erstreckt als die männliche. Eine solche spezifisch weibliche Genialität, wenn auch durchaus nicht eine ausschließlich weibliche, ist die Genialität des geselligen Verkehrs, die Gabe, die eigene Persönlichkeit durch die Umgangsformen zum Ausdruck zu bringen. So Mayreder therefore lays claim here to the attribute of genius for a Lebensform that was available and acceptable for women of a certain class in Fin-de-siècle Vienna, that of the salon dame. But she ties herself in knots a little bit as to whether it is a specific sign of specifically female genius or not, or whether there is such a thing. So genius, the term, helps her, but also hinders her here to carry through on her ideas, with her ideas. The second conspicuous instance in which genius troubles Mayreder's rejection of gender categories is to be found in her ideal of erotisches Genie, so erotic genius. In the essays Einiges über die starke Faust and Das subjektive Geschlechtsidol, she appeals for a new era in relationships between the sexes, one in which Hingebung, so devotion, giving oneself up, is practiced by both partners equally and not just by the woman. And she's talking only about heterosexual relationships here. The dynamic of any relationship, she writes, should not be inspired by or predicated on gender difference, but should aim instead to overcome gender difference in loving synthesis. Erotische genies are those who are able to achieve this relationship ideal most completely. Mayreder insists that this idea applies as much to women as to men. But the examples that she gives are exclusively male, whereby Grete dominates these essays to the extent that he becomes an interchangeable embodiment of erotic genius. And now I don't have time to talk about Mayreder's other writing today, but I'd just like to note that many of her fictional narrative texts are concerned with this ideal of erotische Genie, but ex negativo. So they're stories of women who believe that they found partners who are geniuses and above gender conventions or above having to treat them as just women, only to be sorely disappointed. For example, the novel Idole, which came out in 1899. But time does not allow today, so I will go on to my third and final case study, Grete Meisel-Hess. Born in Prague in 1879 and educated in Vienna, Grete Meisel-Hess first established herself as a feminist author with articles and reviews for Mayreder's Dokumente der Frauen. Meisel-Hess believed that sexuality was fundamental to all aspects of life, both private and public. Now, this was a conviction that was unusual, or at least unusually voiced so vehemently as she does, even within the most progressive circles of the Viennese women's movement of the time. And in fact, she, in 1905, 1906, she starts orienting herself more towards Berlin and the Berlin women's organizations, and eventually moves there and leaves Vienna. But at this point that I'm talking about, she's still in Vienna. Meisel-Hess called for an end to the double standard that condoned male promiscuity while condemning women for expressing or acting on their sexual desires. She also called for marriage reform, ideally for marriage itself to be replaced by a series of socially recognized, monogamous but short-term relationships that were all to be sexually satisfying, and as soon as they are no longer satisfying, you should be able to move on to the next partner, but not at will. There should be a socially recognized form for doing this, and also social, political, legal recognition for all children of all unions. In her best-selling debut, Fanny Roth, eine Jungfrauengeschichte, 1902, Meisel-Hess's activist concerns crystallize in the figure of a female composer struggling to fulfill her potential as both woman and artist. Georg Brandes summed up the novel as the Tragödie der intellektuellen, genialen Frau in der modernen bürgerlichen Gesellschaft. So the tragedy of the genius woman in modern society. In 1904, Meisel-Hess intervened directly in the debates on gender and genius that were raging in Vienna following the publication of Weininger's Geschlecht und Charakter and, crucially, the suicide of its author. In her extended essay, Weiberhass und Weiberverachtung, so hatred of women and despising women, she not only addressed the book's misogyny and anti-feminism, but also the genius cult growing up around Weininger himself, which acted to amplify and confirm his ideas. Weininger's supporters were presenting his suicide as the inevitable result of his exceptional nature, of his genius, which was out of step with the banality of his times. Meisel-Hess reverses this narrative. Weininger, she writes, may have had genius tendencies, but his conclusions, the conclusions that he comes to in Geschlecht und Charakter, show that he cannot have been a true genius. Denn, this is her reasoning, denn das Genie bringt etwas hervor, das an sich eine bleibende Wahrheit, einen neuen Wert für die Menschheit repräsentiert. Aber gerade die Resultate, zu denen Weininger gelangte, tragen den Todeskeim in sich, während nur die Art, wie er zu ihnen gelangte, ein hochinteressantes, aufregendes geistiges Schauspiel gewährt. So Meisel-Hess notes how Weininger's views on women and femininity only hold up in a purely theoretical, timeless realm, divorced from historical development and social reality. Once he moves from theory to illustrations from real life, he's forced to mutilate both his own ideas and womankind. And she describes this as being like Cinderella's stepsisters trying to fit their feet into the glass slipper. So he has to cut the feet of his theories to get them into the glass slipper, and leaves a sort of trail of blood and destruction and hate behind him. She pulls Weininger's ideas apart very interestingly at this point in her essay. It's well worth taking a look at. Also available to be read online, Austrian Literature Online, great website. Meisel-Hess would, however, and this is very interesting to me, be largely prepared to lay aside their considerable differences when it comes to Weininger's theorizing on genius, which she unconvincingly, just on genius as it were, which she unconvincingly but revealingly, I would say, attempts at points to analyze separately from his ideas on gender and sexuality. So she starts off by saying, you cannot separate his ideas from his misogyny, it's just all pervasive, and you can't read this book without having that idea at the forefront of our minds. But when she gets on to talking more about genius, not so much about Weininger as a genius, but on his theories of genius, suddenly she can sort of not see the misogyny anymore. She can separate the two very interestingly. She wants genius to be saved from his misogyny. So the only point that she questions is Weininger's insistence that genius is primarily characterized by clarity of thought. So Weininger harks back to the Schopenhauerian reine Kontemplation, the idea that genius is completely objective and characterized by great sort of clarity and consciousness of thought. Meisel-Hess appeals instead for recognition of what she calls, I have a quotation, what she calls das Phänomen der halluzinativen visionären Genialität. And she claims that bei den meisten und bedeutendsten unter den Schaffenden der Zustand der Produktion fast immer von einer Art visionärer Entzücktheit getragen ist, die weit abliegt von grellster Klarheit und Helle, mit der derselbe Schaffende sich vielleicht als Kritiker betätigen kann. So she says, genius is invariably associated with a hallucinatory, a visionary sort of trance state, and not with the highest level of rationality. Now, to finish up with, I'd like to take a look at how she herself tries to convey this aspect of genius, this kind of hallucinatory aspect, in combination with her precepts of marriage and Sexualreform in Sünde, so Sin, a novella that she published shortly after her reckoning with Weininger. It's a very lurid, expressionistic text, and to me it seems to be all about genius. It's set 100,000 years from now, far into the future, a future in which humanity has managed to emancipate itself from all mistakes, all passion, and all belief. Disaster looms nevertheless, because a meteor is speeding towards the Earth and threatening it with total destruction. And because of its superior scientific knowledge, humanity knows exactly what's in store for it. So the suffering is caused by knowledge that destruction is nigh. Despairing of this knowledge and the suffering that it brings, the leaders of humanity, 7 old wise men, we're told, call upon the old gods, so they turn to belief again to sort of help them out of their despair, call upon the old gods to send them Eve again, the Urgrund unserer Verderbnis. So Eve is the basic reason for their despair, because she brought knowledge to mankind by picking the apple and giving it to Adam. They want her now to be brought back so they can sacrifice her and avert disaster. An unspecified divinity hears their prayers, and Eve reappears as a fiery redhead in tongues of flame. She admits to her sin of desiring knowledge, but declares that she is and will ever remain ohne Reue. So she doesn't regret it and she'd do it all again. The divinity tells the wise men that humanity has exhausted its Urkraft, so its essential energy, and it's going to be destroyed in any case, with or without the meteor. A dark cloud wipes out the population of the world before the meteors even hit, and Eve, the Urmutter, is given the task of founding a new race. She agrees, but only on the condition that she's free this time to choose her own partner. And here I have a nice little quotation, and I'll just close the window because there's a building site outside. Sorry about that. So Eve agrees that she'll found a new race, but only if she's allowed to choose her own partner. So der Sünde flammende Seele erglüht in Sehnsucht nach einer Vermählung, die nicht der Niedergang sei ihrer selbst. Ein Geschlecht möchte ich gebären, das mir gleich sei, an glorreiche Sündigkeit, das niemals winselnd im Staube liege, wie die Gattung, die ich von Adam empfing. And interesting there, of course, is that ein Geschlecht, das mir gleich sei, is a direct quotation from Goethe's Prometheus ode, which does a lot of heavy lifting in the secondary literature on the Geniezeit as being a poetic representation of this idea of Sturm and Drang, genius, and of the sovereign individual. And here is Eve taking over that very masculine mythologized script of genius. So she's then presented with a series of possible mates, including Hercules and Christ himself, but refuses all of them. At the last, a man appears hung with broken chains and wearing the tattered remains of a panther skin, and he's described to us as follows. Über seinem Haupt schien es zu funkeln und zu sprühen in gelbem, zuckendem Licht. Und so wie sie da stand, umwallt von der roten Lohe der Sünde, so stand er da, umleuchtet von den Blitzen des Frevels. Wer bist du, Starke? Fragte Eve. Der für die Geschaffenen die Flamme des Lebens stahl, wie du für sie den Apfel der Sünde brachest. So here we have Prometheus himself, Prometheus himself appearing, re-embodied as the new mate for Eve to found a new race. And here we have so many genius topoi all in one place, sort of a real concentration of we have fire, we have lightning, we have intimations of infinity, the creation story, Prometheus, Eve as the female creative genius. So the female creative principle, Eve, das sündige Wollen, chooses the male creative principle, Prometheus, die Tat, as her new mate. Their union will bring forth das Geschlecht der werdenden Welt. At the conclusion of the novella, as they embrace, the fire from Prometheus's torch destroys what is left of the earth. So destruction and creativity go hand in hand in this mythologized appeal for sexual reform. So like Weininger, at the end of Geschlecht und Charakter, Meisel-Hess envisages genius as culminating in an end to humanity as we know it. Unlike Weininger, she combines a series of genius topoi, as we've seen, fire, Prometheus, Eve, creation story, with the force of sexual desire and procreation. Gender and genius are therefore inextricably linked in this vision of collective renewal, and genius's iconoclastic power has been reactivated in the form of a futuristic mythologized allegory. I'd like to come to a conclusion. There'd be lots more to say, of course, but I hope to have at least begun to show how women's historically vexed relationship to the concept of genius affected the ways in which they reflected on its icons and cliches at the Fin-de-siècle. At the same time, they were able to use strands of this same discourse in arguments for women's rights and socio-political reforms, albeit with varying levels of success. In particular, we can see them employing what Julia Kristeva, in her biographical trilogy, Female Genius, refers to as, and I quote, the provocative hyperbole of genius. This is genius as a, I quote once again, therapeutic intervention, so pitted against what was perceived as the increasing uniformity and conformity of the modern world. Genius can break through that. Their writing of women at the Fin-de-siècle was fueled by and contributed to the stylistic pluralism of this time, which provided a unique opportunity to revisit a range of genius tropes and figures which had been unavailable or only available obliquely in mid-century realism. Thank you very much for listening.
That was Deborah Holmes, who recorded this fascinating talk on the history and uses of the term genius and its close connections with gender and how they were discussed particularly at the crucial period of the Fin-de-siècle. Thank you very much, Deborah, on behalf of the Ingeborg Bachmann Center and myself. Thank you.